Tunde staggered through the dust-choked path, his feet dragging with each step. His back ached from the long hours spent searching for water, and the weight of the world pressed down on him. The farm was barren, the soil cracked and lifeless. His family, hungry and desperate, awaited his return with no hope of food or shelter. He glanced up at the sky. Not a cloud in sight. Not a drop of rain had fallen in months. What will I tell Ngozi? How will we survive this drought? He muttered under his breath, his voice heavy with hopelessness. His heart beat in time with his slow, deliberate steps. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air grew colder, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the day. Just ahead, a figure appeared in the growing darkness. The man stood tall, his clothes rich and pristine, shining like a beacon in the gloom. His eyes, though, glowed red, like embers of a fire that refused to die. Tunde stopped in his tracks. A chill crept down his spine, but he could not turn away. His exhaustion clouded his judgment, and the figure's presence seemed to pull him in. I see your struggle, farmer, the man spoke softly, his voice smooth as oil. But there is a way out of this misery. Tunde squinted at him, unsure whether he should run or listen. His heart thudded faster, as if his body knew something his mind refused to acknowledge. The stranger smiled, his red eyes flashing brighter. Your farm will prosper, Tunde. Your family will never hunger again. You will have wealth beyond your dreams, if you agree to one small thing. He stepped closer, his presence unsettling, but impossible to ignore. All I ask is your soul when your time comes. Tunde's breath caught in his throat. His mind swirled with the desperate needs of his family, his wife, Ngozi, and his children, who had suffered with him through these long months. They had not eaten properly for weeks. His strength was failing him, but the thought of their hunger gnawed at him more than any physical pain. Tunde hesitated. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his mind racing. Could he really trust this man? Could it be true? Was there such power in the world? But then he thought of Ngozi, of their children's desperate faces. The land that was dying, the crops that would never grow. What choice did he have? I'll do anything, he whispered, his voice cracking as tears welled up in his eyes. Just save my family. Without another word, he reached out and grasped the stranger's hand. A cold, sharp shiver ran through his body, but the stranger's hand felt firm and unyielding. The deal was sealed in silence. Tunde's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of what he'd just done sinking into his bones. Would it work? Would he regret it? But as the stranger stepped back, a cold wind swept through the village, and Tunde felt an unfamiliar sense of power. The stranger nodded once, a knowing smile spreading across his face. Your prosperity is assured, Tunde. But remember, every gift has a price. And with that, he turned, disappearing into the night like smoke in the wind. Tunde stood there, his mind spinning, his body trembling, yet something inside him whispered that he had just made a terrible mistake. But it was too late. The deal was made. The moment Tunde's hand met the stranger's, a coldness surged through his body, sharp and unwelcoming. It spread quickly, from his fingertips to his chest, then down to his legs, as though the very warmth of his soul was being drained. A shiver ran through him, but he ignored it. The desperation that had clouded his thoughts pushed everything else aside. What have I done? He whispered, his voice trembling as doubt gnawed at him. But he shook his head, forcing the thought away. There was nothing else. He had no choice. The stranger's smile lingered in his mind, but Tunde turned and walked away, the promise of prosperity echoing in his ears. When he returned home, everything had changed. The land, once dry and cracked, now blossomed with life. Green crops sprouted from the earth, their leaves thick and glossy, stretching toward the sky. The faint scent of ripe fruit filled the air. It was as if the drought had never existed, as if it was all a distant nightmare. His wife was in the kitchen, stirring something fragrant in a large pot, her face lit with astonishment. She looked up as he entered. Tunde, she exclaimed, eyes wide. Where did all this come from? The crops. They're beautiful. Tunde stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. His mind raced as he looked around. The farm, his broken farm, was now overflowing with life. How could this be real? I don't know, he stammered. But it's here. Everything. The farm, the food, he tried to smile, but the strange chill in his chest would not go away. It's like a dream. Ngozi placed the spoon down and rushed toward him. Her hands cupped his face, her smile warm. This is a blessing, Tunde. A true blessing. We'll never suffer again. Tunde nodded, but his eyes shifted to the lush fields outside the window. Something felt wrong. The images of the stranger's glowing red eyes flashed in his mind. They had burned into his memory, and the more he thought about them, the deeper the unease grew. This wasn't just a blessing. It couldn't be. He muttered to himself, his voice barely above a whisper, "This is too much. Is this a blessing or a curse?" Ngozi, oblivious to his inner turmoil, pulled him toward the table where she had laid out a feast. Freshly baked bread, fruits bursting with color, and steaming bowls of vegetables. The scent filled the room, tempting his hunger. "Come eat," she urged. "We are blessed today." Tunde sat down, but his mind remained far from the feast before him. The red eyes haunted him, the cold hand, the strange promise. His heart pounded with the thought that he had traded something for all of this. Something precious. As Ngozi served him, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. He looked the same, but the unease gnawed at him deeper than before. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had gained came with a price. But what was the cost? "Are we truly blessed?" he whispered, his words lost in the noise of Ngozi's joy. But deep down he feared the truth, that this blessing was not a gift at all. In the days that followed, Tunde's life changed beyond recognition. Gold flowed into his home like rain, and the fields flourished with crops so plentiful, it seemed as if the land itself had been enchanted. His cattle grew strong and fat, and his granaries overflowed. But with every new blessing came a shadow that grew heavier, a dark cloud that lingered over his joy. The villagers began to talk. "Did you see Tunde's farm?" one villager whispered. "It's as though the land obeys him. It's unnatural." Another nodded. "I heard he made a deal with someone strange." Tunde, however, ignored their whispers. He was too busy with his wealth to listen. But at night, when the moon rose high, unsettling dreams haunted him. Dark shadows crept through his mind. He saw his own hand, trembling as it clasped the stranger's cold, pale one. And in the distance, whispers, voices calling to him, begging him to return. His body would jerk awake in a cold sweat, but he dismissed it, shaking off the fear like dust. "The dreams. They feel real," Tunde murmured to himself one night, his breath shallow. "But I have no choice now." Yet, no matter how much he tried to convince himself, something gnawed at him from the inside. As days passed, the distance between him and his family grew. His relationship with Ngozi, once filled with love, began to strain. She noticed the change, the way his eyes had hardened and his voice had lost its warmth. "What's happened to you, Tunde?" Ngozi asked one evening, her voice soft with worry. "You're not the man I married." Tunde turned away, his gaze distant. He could feel the weight of her words, but it was no longer enough to stir him. His thoughts were consumed by the wealth, the power, the success. "I'm not the same man anymore, Ngozi. I've given everything for this." A silence fell between them. Ngozi's heart broke, but Tunde was too lost in his own hunger to notice. The joy of the harvest had faded, replaced by a hunger that no amount of wealth could satisfy. As Tunde stood among his riches, a creeping dread began to settle deep within him. He had everything he could ever want: land, cattle, gold. Yet the more he gained, the more he felt himself slipping away. The warmth, the light in his eyes, it was gone. The land obeyed him, but at what cost? In the quiet of the night, alone with his thoughts, Tunde whispered to the darkness, "I've made a deal with the devil. What do I do now?" The words hung heavy in the air, a confession without an answer. His wealth had come at the price of his soul, and now, he was left with nothing but a hollow heart. Tunde was a man of the land, known for his tireless labor. From dawn till dusk, his hands worked the soil, hoping for a harvest that never came. His heart ached as his crops withered under the fierce sun, the soil cracking beneath his fingers, dry and unforgiving. He looked at the parched earth, frustration bubbling in his chest. "I've worked the soil for years," Tunde muttered, wiping his brow. "But it gives nothing in return." The village of Adabule was no different. The drought had taken hold of every farm, every home. Yet, even with the harshness around them, Ngozi, Tunde's wife, held onto a quiet hope. She could see the weight in his eyes, but she spoke gently as always. "We will get through this, Tunde. We always do." Her words were soft, but Tunde couldn't shake the fear that gnawed at him. He had tried everything. And the land, once generous and rich, now seemed to mock him with its emptiness. With each passing day, the weight of hunger grew heavier. Tunde's children cried from hunger, and his body was worn thin from worry. His heart was breaking, unable to provide for them. He would stare at their innocent faces, wondering how he could ever face them again. "How can I look my children in the eye when I have nothing to give them?" He sighed deeply, his voice barely a whisper. Ngozi, though weary herself, remained patient. "We will find a way, Tunde. Just hold on." But Tunde felt time slipping away. The village was suffering too. Once, he was a man of honor and kindness, but now, even the villagers were beginning to doubt how much longer they could endure. The crops had failed them all. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Tunde trudged home after yet another fruitless search for water. The road seemed endless, and his steps grew heavier with each mile. It was then, in the fading light, that he saw him, the stranger with eyes glowing red like the embers of a dying fire. The stranger's voice was smooth, like silk. "I see your pain, Tunde. Your struggle is known to me." Tunde froze. His mind was tired, and his soul was worn from the fight, but something in the stranger's gaze felt strange. Still, desperation clouded his judgment. "What do you want?" Tunde asked, his voice trembling. The stranger smiled, his lips curling like a serpent. "I offer you a deal," he said. "Endless crops, wealth beyond imagination, and a future without suffering. All I ask in return is your soul." Tunde's heart raced. His family was starving. His land was dying. Could he afford to say no? "I will do anything to save my family," Tunde said, his voice barely a whisper. He reached out, his hand trembling as he grasped the stranger's. As their hands met, a chill ran through him, cold and sharp like the winds of the forgotten lands. But the promise of prosperity numbed his senses, and he could not pull away. The next day, Tunde's farm was no longer barren. The earth had come alive. Crops sprang from the soil, their green leaves shining like jewels in the sunlight. The once dying trees bloomed, heavy with fruit. Tunde could hardly believe his eyes. It was as if the land itself had been transformed by some unseen force. Ngozi, stunned by the sight, gasped. "Look, Tunde. The land is alive again." Tunde's heart should have swelled with joy, but instead, a strange unease began to settle in his chest. The land had given him everything, but inside him, something felt wrong. His hands, once calloused and worn, now felt strange, as if they belonged to someone else. His heart was no longer full of the warmth that once guided him. Soon, the village took notice. Tunde, once a humble farmer, had become a symbol of prosperity. His land, his wealth, everything was flourishing. The villagers spoke in awe, whispering of how Tunde's farm was blessed by the gods. "Tunde's land is blessed by the gods," one villager marveled. But as the riches grew, so did the coldness in Tunde's heart. The smile that once lit his face seemed distant now, his eyes hollow. His joy had been replaced by a hunger he could not explain. At night, Tunde lay in his bed, but sleep brought him no peace. Instead, his mind was filled with strange visions. Dark shadows seemed to follow him, their eyes glowing like embers. He could hear whispers, voices calling his name, pulling him toward something he could not see. Every time he awoke, drenched in sweat, he could feel the weight of something unseen watching him. "The dreams. They feel real," Tunde whispered to himself one night, his breath heavy and shallow. "But I have no choice now." The weight of his choices bore down on him, but it was easier to push the fears aside. The riches, the land, they were real. His family no longer went hungry. The villagers admired him. But something inside him was slipping away, like sand through his fingers. As the days passed, Tunde's relationship with Ngozi began to fray. Her once tender touch now seemed to bring him no comfort. She could feel the change, the distance growing between them. Concern filled her voice one evening. "Tunde, you are not the man you were. What has happened to you?" Tunde's heart hardened at her words. Once, he would have taken her hand and assured her that everything would be fine. But now, he only felt irritation. His eyes darkened, and he turned away from her. "I've done what I had to do, Ngozi," he snapped. "Don't question me now." The villagers no longer saw the kind man they once revered. Instead, they saw a man driven by greed, a man whose heart had been consumed by something darker than wealth. The whispers in the village grew louder, and Tun's soul became a shadow of the man he had once been. As the days passed, Tun's farm flourished like no one had ever seen. The crops grew tall, strong, and plentiful. His cattle multiplied, their skins shining in the sun. But with each passing day, Tun's heart grew heavier. The land had given him everything, but it demanded more than he was willing to pay. "I shouldn't have done it. What have I become?" Tund muttered to himself as he looked out over his vast fields, feeling an emptiness inside that no amount of gold could fill. The villagers had once celebrated his success, but now, there was fear in their eyes. They whispered behind his back, wondering what dark forces had allowed him to rise so quickly, so unnaturally. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices filled with doubt and worry. "Have you seen how he's changed?" one villager whispered. "It's as if the man we knew is gone." Another added, "I hear strange noises at his house at night. Something is wrong." But Tund ignored their whispers. He saw only the growing piles of riches and the power he now held. His wealth was like a shadow that followed him, always lurking, always demanding more. And with it, his heart became colder. The man who had once cared for the land, for his people, was slipping away. Tund began making ruthless decisions. People who had once stood by him, offering help and friendship, now found themselves cast aside. He no longer needed them. They were no longer useful. "You're no longer useful to me," Tund said coldly to a former friend. "Leave." The friend, his face a mixture of hurt and confusion, hesitated, but then walked away. Tund didn't care. He had more land to acquire, more power to seize. He manipulated the village leaders, bending them to his will. "Sign the papers. Don't ask questions," he ordered. His words were sharp like the edge of a blade. Tund was no longer the man who had struggled in the fields, hoping for a better life. Now, he used his newfound wealth and power to exploit the very people who had once supported him. Workers who labored on his land were pushed to their limits, forced to work under unbearable conditions, all for his growing fortune. "Tund, this is too much," one worker pleaded, his voice cracking from the heat. "The ground is too hard, and the sun. You'll work until the job is done, or I'll find someone else," Tund snapped, not even bothering to look at the man. The worker stood in stunned silence before trudging back to his work, too afraid to argue. But Tund barely noticed. His heart had hardened, and the weight of his success felt lighter than ever. At home, things were no better. His wife, Ngozi, watched the man she had married slip further and further away. She pleaded with him to stop, to remember the values they had shared. But Tund was no longer interested in hearing her concerns. "This isn't the man I married," Ngozi said one evening, her voice filled with sadness. "You've become someone else." "The man you married is gone," Tund responded coldly, his voice distant. "This is who I am now." Ngozi looked at him with tears in her eyes, but Tund couldn't bring himself to care. He was too far gone, too consumed by the power he had gained. His eyes no longer softened when he looked at her. The love they once shared had turned into something cold and unrecognizable. The villagers noticed the change as well. They saw how the once kind Tund had become cruel, and whispers of fear began to spread. People no longer sought his help, afraid of what he had become. But Tund felt no guilt. His success, his wealth had come at a price, and he had paid it. Or so he thought. One night, after a particularly heated argument with a former friend, Tund found himself alone in his house. His thoughts raced, and his heart pounded in his chest. The feeling of something dark, something ominous, had been following him for some time now. And just as he thought he might escape it, he heard a sound, a cold, mocking laugh. He turned, his breath catching in his throat. The figure before him was no longer the stranger he had met that fateful day. The man's glowing red eyes had darkened, and his smile was twisted, full of malice. "Did you really think you could escape the consequences of our deal?" The devil's voice was like the crackling of fire, hot and cruel. Tun's heart raced. He stumbled backward, trying to grasp the situation. "What have I done?" he gasped. "I don't want this anymore. Please. There must be something I can do." The devil's laughter echoed through the room, cold and mocking. "Too late, Tund," he said, his voice dark and final. "There is no way out." Tund fell to his knees, panic rising in his chest. But no matter how much he begged, no matter how desperate he became, the devil's grip tightened. His heart was trapped. His soul was lost. In a frenzy, Tund ran to the home of Elder Oluwazian, hoping for guidance, hoping for a way out. The elder, known for his wisdom, had seen many things in his long life, but he had never seen someone so consumed by greed and fear. Tund arrived, breathless, his eyes wide with desperation. "Please, tell me there's a way to break the deal." Tund pleaded, falling to his knees before the elder. "I can't live with this anymore." The elder's eyes were filled with sorrow. "Once the devil has claimed your soul, there is no escape. You must face the consequences of your choice." Tund's body trembled. He could feel the devil's presence still lurking, the weight of the deal pressing down on him. "No. There has to be another way. Please help me." The elder stood silently, his eyes filled with ancient wisdom. "You've entered a dangerous game," he said softly. "You must pay the price." Tund's mind raced. Desperation burned in his chest as he turned away, searching for any possible solution. But the more he fought, the stronger the devil's hold became. There was no escape. There was only the price of his choice. "What must I do?" Tund shouted to the heavens, his voice breaking. "I can't escape him." The elder's words echoed in his mind, cold and final. "You've already made your choice. Now you must face the price." Tund's heart sank, realizing the truth too late. The devil had won. And there was no going back. Ngozi stood before Tund, her eyes filled with unspeakable pain. She could no longer hold the words inside, could no longer pretend that everything was as it once had been. She had watched him change, become someone unrecognizable, and now, her heart was broken beyond repair. "You're not the man I married." Ngozi's voice cracked like dry earth beneath the weight of a storm. "You've destroyed everything. The children, the village, us. We are nothing now. Because of you." Tund, hollow-eyed and distant, didn't respond immediately. His gaze was lost in the empty fields that stretched before him. The land, once a place of hard work and hope, now lay barren and unyielding. His heart was a void, filled with regret that seemed to echo endlessly. "I've lost everything, Ngozi," Tund muttered. "Everything I ever loved." His voice was barely above a whisper, the words heavy with the weight of his failure. He turned his gaze toward the ground, his eyes tracing the cracks in the soil. Once, this land had been rich, full of life. Now, it was as if the earth itself had turned its back on him. "What good is wealth?" Tund whispered, his voice trembling, "if it costs everything I was?" His words hung in the air, but they brought no comfort. He could see it now. His farm, his riches, his power, meant nothing if he had lost his family and his soul. The devil's bargain had promised him everything, but delivered only destruction. He was alone, with no one left to turn to. In his darkest hour, Tund called upon the devil once more, hoping for redemption, hoping that somehow there might still be a way out. "I've made a terrible mistake," Tund cried, his voice breaking. "What can I do to make it right? Please tell me. I'll do anything. I can't live with this anymore." The devil appeared, his grin wide and knowing. His eyes glowed with an otherworldly fire, and his voice was like the rustling of 1,000 shadows. "You've lost everything, Tund," the devil mocked, his voice dripping with malice. "One final deal, and you can save what's left. Your soul, in exchange for the chance to restore what you've broken." Tund's heart pounded. The temptation was strong. Everything within him screamed for the chance to undo the damage, to save his family, to restore the peace. But something inside him, something that had been buried for so long, stirred. "I can't keep trading pieces of myself," Tund said, his voice firm, though it shook with fear. "I've given enough. No more." The devil's laughter filled the air, cold and bitter. He had won, and Tund's refusal only solidified it. The devil's eyes gleamed, and with a snap of his fingers, the wrath of his power was unleashed. The skies darkened. The once thriving crops shriveled and died, their roots turning to dust. Homes that had stood for generations crumbled to the ground, their walls shattered like fragile clay pots. The village, once full of life, now lay in ruin. "What is happening to us?" a villager cried, his voice full of terror as he looked at the destruction around him. "We are ruined." The devil's voice echoed, ringing through the village like thunder. "You wanted wealth? You wanted power?" The devil sneered. "Now you get to see the cost." Fear spread like wildfire among the villagers. The very earth beneath their feet seemed to betray them. They had once looked at Tunde with awe, admiring his riches and his success. Now, they saw him as the source of their misery. "Tunde," another villager shouted, pointing a trembling finger at him. "You brought this upon us. You cursed us all." Tunde stood alone, facing the anger and fear of the villagers. He had no defense, no way to make them understand. He had lost everything: his land, his family, his respect, and there was nothing left to fix it. As the fire of the devil's wrath consumed the village, Tunde looked around at the ruins of his life. The crops were gone, the homes reduced to rubble, the people who once respected him now turned against him. There was no one left to turn to. His soul was as broken as the land he had once tended with love and care. "I've lost everything," Tunde whispered to himself, the truth sinking in like a dagger to his heart. "There is nothing left to save." And as the flames of destruction danced around him, Tunde understood the true cost of his choices. It was never the land, the crops, or the wealth that mattered. It was never the power he had so desperately sought. The true price was the destruction of everything he had loved: the land, his family, the respect of his people. Tunde's fate was sealed. There was no escaping the consequences of his actions. He was left standing alone, amidst the ashes of his choices, knowing that the devil's bargain had cost him everything. In the end, there was nothing left to save. Tunde stood in the middle of the ruins, his hands trembling as he stared at the land that once thrived beneath his touch. The rich soil that had yielded crops in abundance was now a barren wasteland. His wealth, once so vibrant, had turned to dust. The gold and the land, the power he had craved, meant nothing now. He whispered to himself, "I had everything. And now nothing." The weight of his actions pressed on him, heavier than any gold. His choices had led him here, to this hollow place of regret. It was not just the earth that was destroyed, it was his life, his very soul, torn apart by greed and selfishness. The devil's promise had been empty, a cruel trick, and now there was no way back. Ngozi, who had stood by his side for so long, had already left. She could not bear the man he had become. She packed her things in silence, the children's laughter now absent from the house, the warmth of their family now a distant memory. She looked at him one final time, her voice shaking with pain. "I can't stay here anymore, Tunde. You've lost your soul." Tunde watched helplessly as she walked away, carrying their children in her arms. His heart shattered, but there was no one left to comfort him. His once loving home was now empty, cold, a mere shell of what it had been. The villagers, once awed by his success, now whispered in fear and disappointment. They had seen what power had done to him, how it had corrupted his soul. They no longer looked at him with admiration but with pity, and sometimes with disgust. One villager leaned over to another, their voices hushed but sharp. "Remember his tale. Never let greed rule your heart." Tunde heard the whispers as he walked past them, but there was no solace in their pity. He was no longer a hero in their eyes, he was a warning, a cautionary tale. A man who had sought power at the cost of everything valuable, and in the end, had lost it all. From the shadows, the devil watched, a silent observer of Tunde's downfall. He had claimed Tunde's soul, and now he reveled in his misery. "You thought you could outsmart me," the devil's voice hissed from the darkness, full of twisted pleasure. "Look at you now." Tunde froze, a cold shiver crawling down his spine. The devil had left him, but his presence lingered, a constant reminder of the pact he had made. He was alone now, tormented by his guilt, with no way to escape the consequences of his actions. "I traded my soul for nothing," Tunde whispered, his voice broken. "And lost everything." The pain of his choices overwhelmed him, and for the first time, he truly understood the price of his greed. It was not just his land, his wealth, or his power that he had lost. He had lost his family, his respect, his love, everything that had once made him whole. As the days passed, Tunde wandered aimlessly, his mind a storm of regret. He thought of the years he had spent chasing after wealth, forgetting the things that truly mattered. The power he had gained meant nothing. It was the love of his family, the respect of his people, the simple joys of life, that were priceless. Power never mattered, Tunde murmured to himself. It was love, it was family, it was respect. That was everything. His heart was heavy with the realization that it was too late. He had sacrificed too much for something that had ultimately led to his downfall. Determined to find a way to make amends, Tunde sought out the elder of the village. The elder, wise and calm, had always been a voice of reason. Perhaps, Tunde thought, he could show him a way to redeem himself. Maybe there was a chance, a glimmer of hope left. Please, Tunde pleaded, falling to his knees before the elder. Help me find a way back. I can't live with myself. I need to make things right. The elder's gaze was steady, his expression solemn. He did not speak immediately, but when he did, his words were like a weight pressing down on Tunde's chest. Some mistakes cannot be undone, Tunde, the elder said, his voice quiet but firm. What's lost is lost. Tunde's heart sank. He had hoped for redemption, for some way to reverse the damage he had done. But the elder's words were a cold truth. The path he had chosen had led him here, and there was no going back. As Tunde stood there, broken and alone, he realized that redemption was beyond his reach. He had sought power and wealth, but in doing so, he had destroyed everything that had truly mattered. Now, with nothing left but his shattered soul, he could only face the consequences of his choices. The weight of his regrets would follow him always, a reminder that the cost of greed was too great. Tunde's tale serves as a powerful reminder, one that echoes through the generations. The narrator's voice, calm but firm, carries the weight of the lesson. Tunde thought wealth was worth more than his soul, the narrator says, but he paid the cost with his very life. In the end, all his riches crumbled like sand through his fingers, leaving only the ruins of his choices behind. His ambition had blinded him, and in his pursuit of more land, more power, more wealth, he lost the most valuable treasures a man can possess: love, respect, and the bond of family. The narrator pauses for a moment, the message sinking in. In the end, Tunde learned the hard way that shortcuts lead only to sorrow. True strength comes from hard work, honesty, and love. These were the things he had sacrificed in exchange for fleeting riches. And now, he had nothing. As the tale reaches its closing, the narrator speaks with clarity, the wisdom of ages in their voice. No wealth or land is worth more than the love of family or the respect of one's people, they reflect, knowing that these are the treasures that last. Tunde's story is not just a warning, it is a reflection of what happens when one's heart is consumed by greed, leaving only emptiness in its wake. And as the story winds down, the narrator offers one last, powerful word of caution. Remember, even in the darkest moments, our humanity is the light that will guide us home. The story ends here, but the lesson endures, ringing in the hearts of all who hear it. The true measure of success is not found in gold, but in love, honor, and integrity.